In the waning days of the Roman Republic, as Rome's legions marched westward through Gaul and crossed swords with rebellious provinces, a darker presence loomed silently to the east. It was not yet war, but it was not peace either. The kingdom of Parthia, heir to the Persian Achaemenids in spirit if not form, had risen across the Tigris River and now stared across a border drawn in dust and ambition. Though separated by geography, the empires of Rome and Parthia were bound by an inevitability as ancient as empire itself. Conflict was coming. The early encounters between Rome and Parthia were uneasy, laced with rivalry, diplomacy, and distrust. In the east, Parthia had become a power to be reckoned with, having shaken off Seleucid control and carved out an empire that stretched from the Euphrates deep into the Iranian plateau. It was a realm of horsemen, of noble lineages, and of fierce independence. Rome, by contrast, was still learning how to administer empire, growing from a republic that had subdued the Mediterranean into an aggressive superpower with an appetite for more. The first brushes between the two powers came not on the battlefield, but in the contested lands of Armenia. A rugged, mountainous region, Armenia stood as a buffer between the west and the east, a place of shifting loyalties and thrones bought with foreign influence. Rome viewed Armenia as a necessary bulwark to protect its eastern provinces, Syria and Cappadocia, while Parthia saw it as a natural extension of its sphere of influence. Tigranes the Great of Armenia had once ruled from the Caspian to the Levant, his court a beacon of splendor and ambition. But as Rome pushed into the east under the campaigns of Lucullus and later Pompey the Great, Armenian sovereignty began to fracture. Pompey, after defeating Mithridates of Pontus, imposed Roman authority over the region, planting Rome's banner near the Parthian border. This act was not missed by the Parthians. Though they offered no immediate resistance, their silent disapproval was clear. The Euphrates became a symbolic fault line, unofficial, but known. A river that separated not just land but worldview, Roman order versus Persian nobility, Western conquest versus Eastern tradition. Rome's eastern expansion had awakened something long dormant in the east, a memory of the past, of the Persian Empire that had once ruled the known world. Though the Parthians lacked the bureaucratic reach of Darius and Xerxes, they maintained the pride and legacy of those ancient kings. They saw themselves not just as rulers, but as custodians of civilization in the East. Rome was a threat, not just military, but cultural. Despite these tensions, the first decades of Roman-Parthian relations were curiously restrained. Rome was distracted by internal rivalries and wars in the West. Parthia, ruled by a dynasty that often faced its own civil unrest and succession crises, did not yet seek open confrontation. But beneath the surface, the borderlands simmered. The ambitions of generals, the shifting loyalty of border kings, and the pride of empires were slowly setting the stage for an inevitable clash. It was Marcus Licinius Crassus, wealthiest man in Rome, triumvir, and political rival to Pompey and Caesar, who would be the first to shatter the uneasy peace. In 53 BC, Crassus marched east with 7 legions, hoping to win personal glory and secure a triumph to rival his more famous peers. His decision was reckless. Parthia had not provoked Rome directly, yet Crassus crossed the Euphrates and began to burn and pillage towns that lay within Parthian control. The Parthians responded not with fear but with calculated speed. A general named Surina, a brilliant commander and master of cavalry warfare, led a force that was numerically smaller than Crassus's legions but infinitely more mobile. At Carrhae, in the flat deserts of Mesopotamia, the Roman dream of eastern conquest was shattered. The Battle of Carrhae would become one of the greatest defeats in Roman history. Parthian horse archers rained arrows upon the heavy Roman infantry, encircling them with relentless mobility. Roman formations, built for close combat, were useless against the elusive cavalry tactics. Crassus, caught between pride and fear, hesitated too long. He attempted to negotiate a retreat, but it ended in betrayal and his own brutal death. Legend holds that molten gold was poured down his throat, a cruel jest by the Parthians to mock his insatiable greed. The implications were staggering. Not only had a Roman triumvir fallen in disgrace, but the Parthians had also captured the legionary standards, symbols of Roman might. These eagle-topped banners, revered by soldiers and people alike, were paraded as trophies across Parthian cities. Rome, for all its pride, had been humiliated. But the defeat at Carrhae did more than stain Roman honor. It awakened Rome's full attention to the east. It revealed Parthia not as a minor kingdom, but as a rival capable of resisting Rome's imperial grasp. It also began a centuries-long narrative of revenge, retaliation, and uneasy coexistence. From this moment forward, every Roman emperor who looked east saw not just desert and opportunity, but the shadow of Carrhae. And yet the Parthians, despite their victory, did not press further west. Their military doctrine prized defense and mobility, not prolonged conquest. They returned to their territory, content with their victory and aware of the dangers of overextension. This restraint would become a hallmark of their centuries-long war with Rome. They struck with force, but never with recklessness. Thus, the first great spark of conflict had been struck. Carrhae was not just a military disaster, it was a turning point. The Roman-Parthian wars had truly begun. In the years to come, Rome would not forget. Ambition would rise again, not in Crassus, but in men like Mark Antony, who would march east with legions and pride, eager to redeem Roman glory. And the Parthians would wait. The year was 53 BC, and Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome and a member of the ruling triumvirate alongside Julius Caesar and Pompey Magnus, was burning with unfulfilled ambition. Caesar had conquered Gaul and won fame across the Republic. Pompey basked in his military achievements in the east. But Crassus, though wealthy beyond measure, lacked the one thing Roman aristocracy craved most: military glory. He saw Parthia as his answer, a grand campaign that would finally raise his name to equal heights. Crassus's march into the east was not provoked by Parthian aggression. No border had been crossed, no ally attacked. It was a war of vanity. With 7 legions, some 35,000 Roman heavy infantry, alongside a few thousand Gallic and Syrian cavalry, Crassus crossed the Euphrates River without the Senate's full approval or the justification of national interest. His target, the heart of Parthia. The Parthian Empire, ruled at the time by King Oroda II, was not caught unaware. Intelligence reached the Parthians quickly, and they prepared to meet the invasion with a force not of numbers but of strategy. The general chosen to oppose Crassus was Surina, a man of immense prestige and reputation within Parthia, known not only for his wealth but also for his tactical brilliance. He assembled a force of approximately 10,000 elite cavalry, horse archers and cataphracts, heavily armored cavalry capable of devastating charges. As Crassus advanced deeper into Mesopotamia, he ignored advice from local allies and even from his own officers. Artavasdes II, the king of Armenia and nominal Roman ally, had warned Crassus to approach Parthia through the rugged Armenian highlands, where the terrain would blunt the effectiveness of Parthian cavalry. But Crassus, seeking a swift, direct march and overconfident in the strength of his legions, declined. Instead, he chose the flat, open plains, a fatal mistake. In the blistering heat of the desert near the city of Carrhae, the two forces met. From the outset, Crassus's army was at a disadvantage. The legions were built for set-piece battles against infantry-heavy enemies. They carried heavy shields, short swords, and armor suited for close combat. Against Parthian cavalry, who fought at distance and used speed as their weapon, the Roman soldiers were immobile targets. Surinna's tactics were masterful. His horse archers swarmed the Roman columns, raining arrows upon the tightly packed formations. Their bows were powerful enough to pierce Roman armor, and their horses gave them the ability to strike and withdraw before the Romans could counterattack. Crassus ordered his men into testudo formations, shielded tortoise-like boxes, but while these protected them momentarily, they offered no mobility. The sun beat down on the armored soldiers as arrows found gaps and cracks, wearing them down physically and mentally. The Romans tried to break the encirclement. Publius, the son of Crassus, led a charge of cavalry and auxiliaries to chase off the archers. But Surinna had anticipated this. He lured Publius away from the main force, then surrounded and annihilated his detachment with cataphracts in a sudden, thundering charge. Publius fought valiantly but was cut down. His head was severed and returned to Crassus on a pike, a brutal message. Crassus, now gripped by despair, still refused to retreat or surrender. As night fell, he attempted to negotiate with the Parthians. Surinna, clever and duplicitous, proposed a meeting under a banner of truce. Crassus reluctantly agreed, escorted by a small retinue. But at the meeting point, an argument broke out, perhaps a trap, perhaps misunderstanding. In the chaos, Crassus was struck down, killed either by the Parthians or in the ensuing scuffle. The Roman army, leaderless and broken, tried to retreat under darkness. Some were captured, others scattered across the plains. In the end, of the more than 40,000 who crossed the Euphrates, only a few thousand made it back alive. Over 10,000 were taken prisoner and deported deep into Parthian territory, where they would live and die in exile, some say even reaching as far as Central Asia, legends later claiming they became mercenaries for Chinese warlords. But the most symbolic loss was not of men, but of honor. The Parthians captured the golden aquili, the Roman legionary standards, sacred eagles that embodied the soul of the legions. These were paraded through Parthian cities like Ctesiphon and Seleucia as trophies. The psychological impact in Rome was enormous. Never before had a Roman general of such stature been so decisively defeated, let alone killed in a foreign campaign of his own making. Crassus's death also shattered the political balance within the Roman Republic. With him gone, the fragile alliance between Caesar and Pompey quickly eroded, leading to civil war and the eventual end of the Republic. In this way, the defeat at Carrhae not only marked a military catastrophe but also became a political turning point in Roman history. The Parthians, however, chose not to invade deeper into Roman territory. Surinna, despite his brilliance, was executed shortly afterward by Orodes II, perhaps out of jealousy, perhaps as a warning to others not to grow too powerful. This act deprived Parthia of one of its most capable generals at the height of victory. Rome, bruised and enraged, would not forget Carrhae. The humiliation festered. In the coming decades, Mark Antony would launch another campaign to restore Roman honor, and later emperors would obsess over the captured eagles. Eventually, under Augustus, diplomacy would recover the lost standards, but the memory of Carrhae would linger like a wound that never healed. Rome does not forgive humiliation easily. The defeat at Carrhae had left a scar on the Roman psyche, one that no amount of gold or words could soothe. It was not just the loss of a general or the death of thousands, it was the brutal reminder that Rome was not invincible. And now, with Crassus dead, the triumvirate broken, and Caesar rising in the west, all eyes turned to the east once more. The burden of vengeance fell upon Marcus Antonius, Mark Antony, the charismatic and temperamental general whose destiny would soon become entangled with both war and seduction. By 41 BC, Antony had inherited control over Rome's eastern provinces under the Second Triumvirate. He ruled from Antioch and Tarsus with ambitions far greater than merely governing. To him, Restoring Roman honor against the Parthians was not just a matter of military pride. It was his opportunity to carve out a legacy that would eclipse even Caesar's. And to do that, he knew he needed more than soldiers. He needed alliances, wealth, and unexpectedly, love. Enter Cleopatra VII, Queen of Egypt. Their meeting in Tarsus has passed into legend, the Egyptian queen arriving on a golden barge, dressed as Aphrodite, enchanting the Roman general with wit, wealth, and promise. But theirs was not merely a romance, it was a political union. Cleopatra offered Antony's ships, supplies, and gold. In return, she wanted Roman recognition for her son Caesarion, whom she claimed was Julius Caesar's rightful heir. Together, they dreamed of an Eastern Empire reborn, a fusion of Roman might and Egyptian splendor. But Antony's dreams would soon confront a harsher reality. In 36 BC, he began his long-anticipated Parthian campaign. With over 100,000 troops, including Roman legions, auxiliary forces, and allied contingents from Armenia under King Artavasdes II, Antony believed he had the numbers and momentum to strike deep into Parthian lands. His target was not merely reprisal, it was conquest. He aimed to march through Media, seize the Parthian capital at Ecbatana, and finally avenge Crassus by planting Roman eagles deep in the Iranian plateau. The campaign began with promise. Antony's forces advanced swiftly into Armenia and then into Atropatene, modern-day Azerbaijan, where they besieged the fortress of Fraspa. But Parthian resistance was elusive and deadly. Rather than engage in open battle, the Parthians relied on harassment, ambushes, and scorched-earth tactics. They attacked supply lines, burned crops, and avoided Antony's heavy infantry. Just as they had done to Crassus, the Parthians let the desert and time become their greatest weapons. Antony soon realized the siege of Fraspa was dragging on too long. His siege engines, transported from Syria, were ambushed and destroyed. His troops, stretched thin and far from supply lines, grew weary. And when news reached him that King Artavasdes of Armenia had withdrawn his cavalry support, Antony's campaign began to unravel. Deprived of mobility, exposed to constant skirmishes, and running low on provisions, Antony had no choice but to retreat. The retreat from Parthia was a catastrophe in slow motion. Parthian horsemen stalked the Romans day and night, picking off stragglers, launching sudden raids, and vanishing into the steppe. Roman discipline held, but only just. Marching over 300 miles to the safety of Armenia, Antony lost nearly 30,000 men. Frostbite, disease, and hunger claimed more than enemy blades. And though the retreat was more orderly than Crassus's disaster at Carrhae, it felt no less humiliating. When Antony finally returned to Egypt in 34 BC, he did not come as a conqueror. His enemies in Rome, especially Octavian, the future Augustus, seized on the failure. They painted Antony as a deluded traitor, seduced by a foreign queen, squandering Roman lives for personal glory. To counter these attacks, Antony launched a theatrical display in Alexandria, the Donations of Alexandria. In a lavish ceremony, he and Cleopatra distributed eastern lands to their children, declared Caesarion, King of Kings, and proclaimed a new world order with Egypt at its heart. To Rome, it was treason. Octavian used the event to turn public opinion against Antony. The Senate, already suspicious of his ties to Cleopatra, declared war, not on Antony, but on Cleopatra herself. The stage was now set for the final act in Rome's long transformation, the Battle of Actium in 31 BC. But before that reckoning, Antony had one last score to settle. In 34 BC, enraged by the betrayal of Artavasdes of Armenia, Antony invaded the kingdom and captured the king. Artavasdes was paraded through Alexandria in chains, a cruel echo of Roman triumphs. Antony crowned Cleopatra, Queen of Kings, hoping to replace the memory of military failure with imperial pageantry. But it was too little, too late. Rome wanted victories, not theater. The Parthians, meanwhile, watched these events with a mixture of caution and satisfaction. Once again, they had resisted a Roman invasion. Though they had not won a decisive battlefield victory like Carrhae, they had drained Rome's strength through attrition and strategy. And more importantly, they had kept their independence intact. The lesson was becoming clear. The Parthian Empire could not be toppled by brute force alone. Antony's failed campaign exposed the limits of Roman power in the east. The legions could conquer Gaul, Britain, and Hispania, but the wide steppes and mountains of Parthia remained a different world. One where speed, terrain, and political instability could undo even the mightiest general. When Antony and Cleopatra eventually fell at Actium and died in Alexandria, their dreams of an Eastern empire died with them. Octavian emerged as the sole ruler of Rome, becoming Augustus and ending the Republic. His approach to Parthia would be different, less about conquest, more about diplomacy. But the rivalry endured. Rome's eastward obsession had left deep scars. Crassus's corpse desecrated, Antony's armies broken, and thousands of legionaries lost in foreign deserts. But now, under Octavian, soon to be Augustus, the Republic had transformed into empire. The days of reckless conquest for personal glory were over. What came next was calculated, diplomatic, and perhaps most importantly, symbolic. Augustus, unlike his predecessors, understood that the war with Parthia was not just a matter of geography, it was a contest of prestige. And at the center of that wound were the lost Aquili, the golden eagle standards taken at Carrhae. For over 3 decades, those eagles had remained in Parthian hands, their presence a constant humiliation in Roman eyes. Augustus knew that to truly consolidate his rule and to complete the legacy of vengeance, he didn't have to conquer Parthia. He just had to restore Roman honor. The timing was crucial. Following the defeat of Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, Augustus became master of the Roman world. But his victory was fragile. Veterans demanded land. Senators whispered. Provinces needed administration. The empire was powerful but unstable, and Augustus needed a symbol, something that could unite Romans around a common cause. The memory of Carrhae offered just that. To understand his enemy, Augustus studied them. The Parthian Empire, now under King Phraates IV, was facing internal divisions. Rival claimants, court intrigue, and revolts plagued the eastern court. Augustus seized the opportunity not with legions, but with leverage. He supported a rival to Phraates, a pretender named Tiridates III, arming and hosting him as a future, friendly, Parthian king. The message to Phraates was clear: cooperate, or face a Roman-sponsored coup. But Augustus also dangled a more personal incentive. Phraates had sent his young sons to Rome as hostages, a common diplomatic practice in the ancient world. They were treated with dignity, educated in Roman customs, and intentionally or not, became tools in Augustus's campaign. The emperor made no move against Parthia militarily but applied slow, relentless pressure through diplomacy and threat. In return for the hostages' safety and stability in his kingdom, Phraates was asked for one thing: the return of the eagles. It worked. In 20 BC, after years of tension and back-channel negotiations, Phraates IV agreed to a peace treaty. The Parthians would return the lost standards from Carrhae, along with several captured Roman prisoners. No Roman territory was ceded. No battle had been fought. But for Rome, it was a triumph of the highest order. Augustus knew how to craft the story. The return of the eagles was paraded not as a diplomatic arrangement but as a grand victory, Rome's pride restored not by war, but by the wisdom and authority of its first emperor. The eagles were carried into the city with ceremony, placed inside the temple of Mars' altar, Mars the Avenger, a new sanctuary built in the Forum of Augustus specifically for this occasion. Statues were commissioned. Coins were minted with the inscription, Parthia subacta, Parthia subdued. In visual terms, Augustus had defeated an empire without drawing a sword. To the Roman people, especially the veterans who still remembered the shame of Crassus and Antony, this was nothing short of a miracle. Yet beneath the surface, Augustus's strategy revealed a deeper transformation. The Republic, once defined by expansion through warfare, was now under the rule of an emperor who saw empire maintenance as more important than endless conquest. Augustus understood the limits of Roman power. He had no illusions of marching into the Iranian plateau or laying siege to Ctesiphon. Instead, he treated the eastern frontier as a delicate balance, buffer kingdoms, alliances, and displays of strength without provocation. Still, the peace was uneasy. The Euphrates River had now become the informal border between two great powers, Rome to the west, Parthia to the east. On its banks, ambassadors and armies watched each other with suspicion. Armenia, lying between them, became a pawn in a constant game of influence. Roman emperors would install pro-Roman kings, Parthians would counter. The diplomatic Cold War had begun. But for a brief time, Augustus had brought stability. The return of the eagles was not just a symbolic victory. It legitimized Augustus's new role as princeps, first citizen, more than any military campaign could. He styled himself not as a conqueror, but as the bringer of peace, Pax Romana, the Roman peace. Even Virgil, in his Aeneid, hinted at this achievement, portraying Augustus as the one who would close the doors of the temple of Janus, the god of war, and bring peace to the world. Yet the Parthians were not conquered. They remained proud and defiant, their empire flourishing from the Euphrates to the Industry. They had lost nothing but symbols, and in exchange, preserved their independence. The balance of power held, for now. But the borderlands would remain volatile. Armenia, Syria, and Mesopotamia would see countless future campaigns, betrayals, and occupations. Augustus had succeeded where others had failed, not by force, but by restraint. Augustus had restored the Roman eagles through diplomacy, and with them, a fragile peace across the eastern frontier. But peace in the Roman world was never permanent. It was a balance of intimidation, politics, and timing. As Augustus grew older, he began shaping his successor, not just as a ruler, but as a steward of that delicate equilibrium between Rome and Parthia. His chosen heir was not a bold orator like Caesar, nor a fiery general like Antony. He was quiet, calculating, and burdened by a sense of duty, Tiberius. Tiberius Claudius Nero was a man shaped by war, exile, and reluctant power. While his reputation as emperor would later be overshadowed by paranoia and cruelty, in his earlier years he had shown promise as a skilled military leader. Augustus knew that to secure the legacy of peace, and the Roman grip on the east, he needed Tiberius to enforce Roman authority without igniting another carry. The opportunity to test his heir came from the same place Rome and Parthia had always contested, Armenia. Nestled between the two empires, Armenia was more than a mountainous buffer state. It was a political chessboard. Every Armenian king crowned with Roman support drew Parthian ire. Every Parthian-backed prince stirred Roman retaliation. And now, in 20 BC, following the return of the eagles, Armenia was once again unstable. Its throne was vacant, and both Rome and Parthia prepared to fill it. Augustus sent Tiberius east with a simple mission: install a pro-Roman king without war. Tiberius's march into Armenia was cautious and deliberate. He led a sizable Roman force, not to wage battle, but to serve as a silent threat. War loomed in the background, but never arrived. Through a blend of diplomatic pressure and strategic movement, Tiberius oversaw the crowning of Tigranes III, a Roman-educated noble with ties to both Armenia and Rome. It was a calculated triumph. Parthia, still nursing its own internal wounds, did not intervene. This quiet maneuver may seem insignificant compared to the glory of Caesar's conquests or the drama of Antony's campaigns, but to Rome, it meant everything. It proved that Augustus's model, projection of strength without unnecessary bloodshed, could work. The eastern frontier could be maintained through presence, poise, and power held in reserve. Tiberius's success in Armenia earned him the trust of Augustus. But it also cast a long shadow over future emperors. Rome had gotten used to the idea that the East was a place of prestige, a proving ground for heirs. Just as Crassus had sought glory in Parthia, and Antony had sought redemption, future emperors would view the eastern frontier not just as a geopolitical challenge, but as a crucible for imperial ambition. And while Tiberius had avoided war, he had not dispelled the tensions. Parthia, under King Phraates IV, was watching closely. Though unwilling to provoke Rome directly, they responded by solidifying control over their side of the Euphrates, reinforcing client states, and sending envoys to ensure Rome's next move wasn't more aggressive. A careful calm settled over the region, but it was a calm laced with mistrust. By the time Augustus died in 14C, the balance he had maintained was past the Tiberius, now emperor. His ascension was smooth, but his rule cold and distant. Tiberius distrusted the Senate, withdrew from Rome's public life, and ruled with icy efficiency. His foreign policy followed the same quiet logic: avoid reckless expansion, maintain the status quo, and don't provoke unless provoked. But not everyone in Rome shared his patience. During Tiberius's reign, the Eastern question flared once more. In 35C, a new Armenian king, Artabanus, rose to the throne with Parthian support. Rome saw this as a breach of the delicate balance. Once again, Armenia had become the spark. Tiberius, now aging and increasingly reclusive on the island of Capri, responded in his signature way, not with open war, but with counter-diplomacy. He sent Lucius Vitellius, a capable administrator and general, east with orders to remove Artabanus without war. Vitellius maneuvered carefully. Through bribes, promises, and a show of Roman strength, he orchestrated the defection of Armenian nobles, isolated Artabanus, and installed a pro-Roman king, Tiridates, on the throne. Parthia, distracted by internal succession crises, once again backed down. Rome had achieved a second victory in Armenia, without a single formal battle. Tiberius's eastern policy had proven effective, but not glamorous. He avoided unnecessary campaigns, focused on subtle power plays, and preserved Roman prestige without the loss of Roman lives. Yet, his model sowed seeds for future conflict. The absence of direct confrontation lulled Rome into a false sense of security. Emperors that followed, Caligula, Claudius, Nero, would inherit the illusion that Parthia could always be outmaneuvered without blood. And Parthia, ever patient, remembered. When Tiberius died, the East held its breath. Rome had remained firm but cautious, enforcing its dominance over Armenia with diplomacy and veiled threats. But Rome's restraint depended entirely on the personality of its rulers, and in 54C, the personality that stepped into power was one of the strangest the empire had ever seen: Nero. Nero Claudius Caesar was only 16 when he ascended the throne. The early years of his reign were guided by the hands of older men, his mother Agrippina, the philosopher Seneca, and the commander Burrus. But as Nero matured, his vanity grew, and his hunger for personal glory began to shape imperial policy. While the emperor sang, performed on stage, and fancied himself a god of poetry, Rome's eastern frontier once again began to shift, and Parthia, too, saw opportunity in the boy emperor's inexperience. In 54 C, a major crisis erupted. Armenia's king, Radamistus, a Roman client, had been overthrown by Tiridates, a brother of the Parthian king Vologases I. This was no mere palace coup. It was a Parthian move to install their own royal house onto the Armenian throne, breaking the delicate balance Augustus and Tiberius had maintained. For the first time in decades, Parthia was openly challenging Rome's dominance in the east. The Roman response was hesitant at first. Nero was more preoccupied with his art and court intrigues than with eastern politics. But pressure from the Senate and the military elite mounted. Losing Armenia to Parthia wasn't just a territorial concern, it was a matter of imperial pride. The ghost of Crassus still haunted the Roman imagination. The loss of Armenia would echo as another failure, another weakness, unless corrected. In 58 C, Nero appointed a seasoned general, Gnaeus Domitius Corbulo, to handle the situation. Corbulo was everything Nero was not: disciplined, severe, and utterly focused. He knew the East, understood its shifting loyalties, and had the respect of the legions. Arriving in Syria, Corbulo did not rush to war. Instead, he rebuilt the morale of the Roman armies, enforcing strict discipline and training his men relentlessly. He prepared not just for a campaign, but for a confrontation that could tip the balance of power. His efforts paid off. In 58 to 59 C, Corbulo launched a swift campaign into Armenia. He took Artaxata, then Tigranocerta, the twin capitals of the kingdom. Tiridates, the Parthian puppet king, was forced to retreat. Rome was in control again. To solidify the victory, Nero installed Tigranes VI, a Roman client, on the Armenian throne. It seemed that the crisis had been resolved in the Roman way, quick, decisive, and humiliating for Parthia. But Parthia was not finished. Vologases I, king of Parthia, could not let Roman success go unanswered. In 62 C, Parthian forces invaded Armenia again, expelling Tigranes and reclaiming the capital cities. War now seemed inevitable. Both sides had drawn blood, and neither would back down without a major concession. Corbulo, sensing escalation, requested reinforcements. Instead, Nero, perhaps hoping for a quick victory, sent another commander, Lucius Caecilius Paetus. Paetus was noble and politically connected but lacked Corbulo's experience. He led a second Roman force into Armenia, but his campaign quickly turned into disaster. At the Battle of Randia in 62 C, Paetus's legions were surrounded and forced into a humiliating surrender. The Roman world reeled. The defeat at Randia threatened everything. It mirrored Carrion shame and exposed the dangers of overconfidence. Nero had a choice: escalate to total war, or restore the situation with caution. He turned once more to Corbulo. With typical efficiency, Corbulo took command of both armies, crossed into Armenia with a superior force, and presented a new solution. Instead of conquering Armenia outright, he negotiated a political settlement with Tiridates himself. In a carefully choreographed display of diplomacy and dominance, Tiridates agreed to travel to Rome and receive his crown from Nero's own hand, symbolically acknowledging Roman superiority. In 66 C, the world watched as a Parthian prince knelt before the Roman emperor in the heart of Rome. Tiridates placed his crown at Nero's feet and declared himself a client of the Roman people. The pageantry was overwhelming: gold, incense, musicians, and spectacle. Nero, dressed in theatrical robes, sat on a golden throne and basked in the illusion of conquest. It was one of the greatest political performances of the Roman Empire. But behind the masks and trumpets, the truth was more complex. Rome had not conquered Armenia. The Parthian prince remained king, though now with a Roman blessing. The Euphrates border remained unchanged. In reality, both empires had accepted a compromise. Armenia would serve as a neutral kingdom, ruled by a Parthian royal who pledged loyalty to Rome. It was neither victory nor defeat, but a truce maintained by pride. For Nero, it was the high point of his reign. Coins were struck proclaiming the triumph. Statues of Nero and Tiridates were raised. The Roman people, hungry for glory, cheered their emperor. But beneath it all, the illusion of peace depended on one thing: the will of emperors to maintain balance. The next emperor might not be so patient. The next Parthian king might not be so reasonable. Corbulo, the architect of that fragile peace, would soon fall victim to Nero's paranoia and be ordered to commit suicide. Nero's empire would descend into chaos only 2 years later, as revolts erupted in Judea and Gaul, and the emperor himself would die by his own hand in 68 C. But the eastern frontier remembered. Tiridates ruled for years, walking a line between two superpowers. Armenia remained a fuse, one spark away from war. And Rome had learned once more that no glory in the east came without a cost. The peace forged between Nero and Parthia had held, for a time. But Rome's eastern frontier was never truly still. Though puppet kings bowed and borders stood unchanged, ambition smoldered beneath the surface. Rome had never forgotten the humiliation of Carrhae, the near surrender at Randia, or the fact that Parthia still ruled lands Alexander had once crossed. When Trajan became emperor in 98 C, he brought with him a different vision, a break from decades of cautious containment. Trajan was a soldier emperor, hard-edged and tireless, the first Roman emperor born in the provinces, Hispania. He believed the empire was not done growing, and in his mind, the east was not a border to be defended. It was a prize to be won. The opportunity came in 113 C. Armenia, ever the fulcrum between Rome and Parthia, had once again fallen into crisis. The Parthian king Osroes I had installed his nephew Axidares on the Armenian throne without Roman consultation, an open breach of the fragile balance that had held since Nero's pageant decades before. For previous emperors, this might have prompted negotiation, or at most a show of force. But for Trajan, it was the excuse he had been waiting for. He gathered his legions, prepared his fleets, and marched east, not merely to restore a client king, but to invade Parthia itself. Trajan's campaign was one of the most ambitious military undertakings in Roman history. In 114 C, he entered Armenia with overwhelming strength. The local resistance crumbled. Within months, Armenia was annexed as a Roman province, no longer a buffer, but claimed outright. The Roman Senate, hungry for glory, hailed him as Armeniacus. But Trajan was just beginning. In 115 C, he crossed the Euphrates, launching a full-scale invasion of Parthia proper. His armies swept through northern Mesopotamia, capturing the cities of Nisibis and Batni. One by one, the fortified cities of the Parthian Empire fell before him. By 116 C, he had seized the Parthian capitals of Seleucia and Ctesiphon, the twin jewels on the Tigris. It was the furthest east any Roman emperor had ever marched. In the heart of the Parthian world, Trajan proclaimed Mesopotamia a new Roman province. Coins were minted bearing the triumphant words, Parthia Capta. Statues of the emperor on horseback, trampling eastern kings beneath his feet, were raised in Roman forums. It seemed as if Rome had finally broken its old rival. But conquest in the east was never so simple. Even as Trajan celebrated, resistance was building. The Parthian king Osroes had fled, but not surrendered. In the south, revolts erupted in Babylon and the newly captured territories. The Roman garrisons, stretched thin across an unfamiliar land, struggled to hold cities where the people spoke different languages and followed foreign gods. In Judea, a brutal Jewish uprising had already begun, tying down Roman legions in the west. And then came the news that would shake everything: rebellion in the provinces and signs of unrest in Rome itself. The empire was too vast, too exposed. Trajan, though victorious on the battlefield, had pushed the empire to its limits. He fell ill during his return journey and died in Cilicia in 117 C, having never seen the capital again. His dream of a Roman Parthia crumbled with him. His successor, Hadrian, viewed the conquests with wary eyes. A builder, a consolidator, not a conqueror, Hadrian immediately withdrew from Trajan's eastern acquisitions. He restored the Euphrates as the de facto border, gave up Mesopotamia, and abandoned the illusion of Roman permanence in the Iranian heartland. The provinces of Armenia and Mesopotamia were undone before they were truly secured. To many in Rome, it seemed like betrayal. But Hadrian saw what Trajan had not: that eastern conquest was like chasing a mirage. Cities could be captured, but not held. Thrones could be taken, but not secured. The cost was too high, the distance too great. No matter how far Rome marched, the east always bent but never broke. And yet, Trajan's campaign changed everything. He had proved that Parthia was not invincible. That Roman steel could reach Ctesiphon. That Rome could claim the east, if only briefly. His name became legendary, not just for his victories, but for daring to achieve what emperors before him had only dreamed. The memory of his invasion lingered for centuries. It set the standard against which all future eastern campaigns would be measured. Emperors like Septimius Severus and Caracalla would look to Trajan's march and try to imitate it. Some would even briefly retake the Parthian capitals. But none would hold them. Parthia itself would soon fade, not from Roman conquest, but from within. By the mid-2nd century, the Parthian dynasty began to crumble. Infighting weakened their court, and Persian nobles, the future Sasanian dynasty, waited in the shadows. The Roman-Parthian rivalry, forged in the desert and sharpened in the mountains of Armenia, was nearing its end. But a new rivalry, with a new empire, would soon take its place. Trajan had awakened the beast. He had marched beyond the Euphrates, seized the Tigris, and reached for the eastern sun. But Rome was not made for the east, and the east would not be Rome's to keep. The Parthian Empire had long been Rome's formidable eastern rival, its feudal horse lords and archers a persistent thorn in the side of Roman expansion. But by the early 3rd century C, Parthia was crumbling from within, succumbing not to Roman swords but to internal decay. This decay paved the way for a new power to rise: the Sasanians. The Parthian dynasty, known as the Arsacids, had ruled since the mid-3rd century BC, maintaining their hold over Iran and Mesopotamia despite the relentless Roman challenge. However, centuries of infighting between noble houses, weak kings, and revolts in outlying provinces had left the empire vulnerable. Its decentralized system, which relied on powerful vassal kings, had become a liability as loyalty fractured. Emerging from this instability was a noble family from Persis, modern Fars province, the Sasanians. Under the leadership of Artashir I, they began a concerted campaign to overthrow Parthian rule. In 224 C, Artashir defeated the last Arsacid king, Artabanus IV, at the Battle of Hormozgan, ending nearly 5 centuries of Parthian dominance. With Parthia's fall, the Sasanian Empire was born, a revitalized Persian power determined to reclaim the glory of the ancient Achaemenid kings. Its rulers envisioned a new Persian empire, centralized and formidable, stretching from the Arabian deserts to the Caucasus mountains. The rise of the Sasanians changed the game completely. Unlike the fractious Parthians, the Sasanians built a strong bureaucratic state and a professional army, blending Persian traditions with innovations inspired by Rome. Their religion, Zoroastrianism, was promoted as the state faith, unifying the empire under a distinct cultural and ideological banner. Rome, however, viewed the new empire with wary eyes. The Sasanians were no mere successor. They were a fierce and organized rival, ambitious to challenge Rome for supremacy in the east. From the outset, the Roman, Sasanian frontier became a powder keg. The first clashes erupted quickly. In 230 CE, Artaxerxes launched raids into Roman Mesopotamia, testing the empire's defenses. Rome responded with military expeditions under Emperor Alexander Severus, but these resulted in inconclusive skirmishes rather than decisive battles. The stage was set for decades of back-and-forth warfare. The struggle intensified under Shapur, Artaxerxes' son, who expanded Sasanian power aggressively. His reign saw the capture of Roman forts, incursions deep into Syria, and the crushing defeat of Emperor Valerian in 260 CE, a humiliation Rome had never suffered before. Valerian was captured alive, and the Sasanian king famously used him as a footstool, a symbol of Persian resurgence. The wars between Rome and the Sasanians would dominate the 3rd to 6th century CE, punctuated by sieges, brutal battles, and complex diplomacy. Each empire sought to control Armenia, Mesopotamia, and parts of the Levant. Cities changed hands repeatedly. Alliances were forged and broken. Peace treaties brokered and shattered. Yet the conflict was more than military. It was a clash of civilizations, Roman law and governance versus Persian monarchy and Zoroastrian tradition. Each empire projected its power through culture, religion, and ideology as much as through armies. Despite centuries of war, neither Rome nor the Sasanians could secure a lasting advantage. The border between them remained a shifting frontier, a zone of conflict and coexistence. Armenian kings, local tribes, and client rulers danced between powers, seeking survival. The Sasanian rise marked the true transformation of the eastern threat, from the scattered Parthian horse lords to a centralized, imperial force. It forced Rome to adapt, leading to reforms in military strategy, frontier defense, and diplomacy. The dawn of the 3rd century CE marked not only the fall of the Parthian Empire, but the beginning of a prolonged and bitter conflict between Rome and the newly established Sasanian Empire. This rivalry would stretch across centuries, becoming one of the most enduring and intense border struggles in antiquity. Unlike previous wars against the Parthians, often characterized by sporadic raids and fluid frontiers, the Roman, Sasanian conflicts took on a new scale of organization, persistence, and intensity. The first real clash between the two empires erupted soon after Artaxerxes' ascension, when the Sasanians tested Roman resolve by crossing into Roman Mesopotamia in 230 CE. The Roman response under Emperor Alexander Severus was cautious but firm. Though no decisive victory was claimed, these early engagements signaled that the Sasanians intended to be a force to reckon with. For Rome, this was a stark reminder that the East remained a volatile frontier. Shapur, son and successor of Artaxerxes, proved to be an even more formidable adversary. His ambition to expand Sasanian control over the fertile lands of Mesopotamia and challenge Roman supremacy was relentless. Early in his reign, Shapur launched successful campaigns against Roman territories, capturing key fortresses and settlements. His skill as a military strategist was evident as he combined traditional Persian cavalry tactics with innovative siegecraft and diplomacy. The pivotal moment came in 260 CE, when the Roman Emperor Valerian marched east to confront Shapur's advances. What followed was a catastrophic defeat for Rome. The Battle of Edessa resulted in the capture of Valerian himself, the only Roman emperor ever taken prisoner by a foreign ruler. This humiliation reverberated through the Roman world, shaking confidence in imperial power. Shapur capitalized on this victory by parading Valerian as a living trophy and consolidating his hold over parts of Mesopotamia. Following this, the wars settled into a brutal pattern. Roman emperors launched punitive expeditions to reclaim lost ground. The Sasanians counterattacked with raids deep into Roman provinces. The cities of Nisibis, Cari, and Dura-Europos changed hands multiple times. Control over Armenia and parts of Syria became a constant bargaining chip. These conflicts were not just about territory. They were contests of ideology, religion, and culture. Rome, increasingly Christianized, found itself opposed by the Zoroastrian Sasanians, each empire embodying its own worldview. Religious differences heightened tensions, particularly in contested border regions populated by diverse peoples. Throughout the 3rd to 6th centuries, the Roman, later Byzantine, and Sasanian empires developed intricate diplomatic relations alongside warfare. Treaties were negotiated, hostage exchanges made, and temporary peace accords established, but these truces rarely lasted long. Each side prepared for the next inevitable confrontation. The military technologies and tactics evolved during this period. The Romans improved their fortifications and adopted cavalry tactics better suited to Eastern warfare, while the Sasanians refined their heavy cavalry known as cataphracts, which became feared throughout the ancient world. Despite centuries of warfare, either empire achieved a decisive, lasting victory. The borderlands remained fluid, with towns and fortresses enduring cycles of siege and capture. Armenia remained a contested client kingdom, its rulers swaying allegiance depending on who held the upper hand. The Roman, Sasanian wars shaped the political landscape of the Near East profoundly. They exhausted resources, strained economies, and influenced internal politics in both empires. The conflict created a cultural exchange through trade, diplomacy, and warfare, leaving a deep imprint on art, religion, and governance. This protracted rivalry persisted until the 7th century when the two empires, weakened by centuries of conflict, faced a new force rising from the Arabian Peninsula, the Islamic Caliphates. The Arab conquests would sweep away the centuries-old Roman, Sasanian rivalry, redrawing the map of the Middle East forever. The Roman, Sasanian rivalry, already fierce and unyielding, reached new heights of intensity during the mid-4th century CE, culminating in the brutal war of 337 to 363 CE. This conflict, sparked by disputes over Armenia and Mesopotamia, was marked by siege warfare, devastating battles, and political intrigue, symbolized most vividly by the grueling siege of Amida in 359 CE. Following the death of Emperor Constantine the Great in 337 CE, the Roman Empire was ruled by his sons, who faced the daunting task of preserving the empire's vast frontiers. The eastern provinces, bordering the aggressive Sasanian Empire under King Shapur II, remained the most volatile. Shapur, determined to assert his dominance and expand his realm, viewed the Roman political transitions as an opportunity to press his advantage. The war began with a series of raids and skirmishes along the frontier, escalating into full-scale invasions. Shapur's forces targeted key Roman fortresses and cities in Mesopotamia, aiming to disrupt the fragile peace and undermine Roman control. One of the most dramatic episodes of the war was the siege of Amida, a heavily fortified city on the Roman eastern frontier, modern-day Diyarbakir in Turkey. Amida was strategically vital, controlling access to northern Mesopotamia and serving as a bulwark against Sasanian incursions. In the summer of 359 CE, Shapur's army, vast, disciplined, and determined, laid siege to Amida. The defenders, led by the Roman commander Ursicinus, were vastly outnumbered but resolute. The city's walls, built strong and high, held firm for weeks despite constant assault. The siege became a brutal test of endurance. Defenders and attackers alike suffered from starvation, disease, and relentless combat. Ancient historian Ammianus Marcellinus, who was present during the siege, provides one of the most detailed accounts of the struggle. He describes the desperate bravery of the defenders and the relentless efforts of the Sasanians, who used battering rams, siege towers, and mining operations to breach the walls. Despite their valiant resistance, the Romans could not hold indefinitely. After a siege lasting nearly 2 months, the Sasanians finally forced a breach. The fall of Amida was followed by a massacre, with many inhabitants killed or taken captive. The loss was a severe blow to Roman morale and exposed the vulnerability of the empire's eastern defenses. The war dragged on for several more years, with shifting fortunes on both sides. Roman generals launched counteroffensives, sometimes regaining lost territory, but were often thwarted by Sasanian military prowess and internal political instability within Rome. Emperor Julian, known as Julian the Apostate, for his rejection of Christianity and desire to restore pagan traditions, took personal command of the Eastern campaign in 363 CE. His campaign initially met with success, advancing deep into Mesopotamia and even reaching Ctesiphon, the Sasanian capital. However, Julian's boldness turned to tragedy. During a chaotic retreat following a failed siege of Ctesiphon, he was mortally wounded in battle. His death marked the end of Roman ambitions for eastern conquest and led to the ascension of Emperor Jovian, who negotiated a humiliating peace with the Sasanians, ceding several frontier territories to Persia. The War of 337 to 363 CE and the Siege of Amida illustrate the enduring difficulty Rome faced in securing its eastern borders. The Sasanians proved relentless adversaries, skilled in siegecraft and mobile warfare, and the Romans were forced to adapt to a new kind of warfare that tested their resources and resilience. This war also highlighted the complex interplay of politics, religion, and military power. The loss of Amida and the death of Julian had far-reaching effects, shaping subsequent Roman strategies and deepening the rivalry between these two great empires. The conflict served as a grim reminder that the eastern frontier was a place where empires met not just in battle but in a test of will and endurance. A place where the fate of cities and the lives of thousands hung precariously on stone walls and the courage of defenders. Centuries following the Roman Empire's transformation into the Byzantine Empire saw the continuation and intensification of conflict with the Sasanian Empire. These Byzantine Sasanian wars, spanning from the late 4th century well into the 7th century CE, represented one of the longest and most grueling rivalries of antiquity. They were marked by shifting alliances, brutal sieges, and battles that tested the endurance of both empires and shaped the political landscape of the Near East. The division of the Roman Empire into eastern and western halves in 395 CE placed the eastern provinces and their Persian frontier under the control of the Byzantine Empire, centered on Constantinople. This Eastern Roman state inherited the ongoing struggle with Persia, continuing a legacy of warfare and diplomacy. The wars were driven by more than territorial ambitions. Control over Armenia, the Caucasus, and Mesopotamia was crucial, not only for military reasons but also for religious and cultural influence. Armenia, in particular, was a contested client kingdom whose allegiance shifted between Rome and Persia, reflecting the broader contest of power. Throughout this long period, the Byzantine and Sasanian empires engaged in numerous campaigns, sometimes with decisive victories, sometimes with costly stalemates. The 5th and 6th centuries saw a series of wars under emperors such as Anastasius I and Justinian I, who both sought to reclaim lost territories and secure the eastern frontier. Justinian's general, Belisarius, famously achieved temporary success by capturing key cities like Nisibis and Amida, but these gains were often reversed. The frontier was a place of constant warfare, with cities and fortresses frequently besieged and sacked. The reign of Khosrow I Anushirvan in Persia marked a high point for the Sasanians. His reforms strengthened the Persian state, improved military capabilities, and led to renewed offensives against Byzantine territories. The war from 572 to 591 CE was particularly brutal, with both empires suffering heavy losses. Peace treaties were repeatedly negotiated but rarely endured. Truces were often fragile, punctuated by border raids and political intrigue. Both empires faced internal challenges, plagues, economic strain, and political instability that affected their ability to wage war. The long struggle culminated in the early 7th century during the reigns of Byzantine Emperor Heraclius and Sasanian King Khosrow II. Heraclius launched a daring counteroffensive in response to a devastating Persian invasion of Byzantine lands, including the sack of Jerusalem in 614 CE and the capture of Egypt. Heraclius's campaigns from 622 to 628 CE are legendary. He crossed the Taurus Mountains, invaded Persia, and scored significant victories, eventually capturing the Persian capital of Ctesiphon. The war ended with the restoration of the status quo ante bellum, but both empires were exhausted. This protracted conflict weakened both the Byzantine and Sasanian states, leaving them vulnerable to new forces emerging on the Arabian Peninsula, the early Muslim caliphates. The subsequent Arab conquests would dramatically alter the region's political and religious landscape, bringing an end to centuries of Roman, Persian rivalry. By the early 7th century CE, the centuries-old rivalry between the Byzantine Empire and the Sasanian Persian Empire was reaching its final and most decisive chapter. Both empires, once dominant powers of the ancient world, found themselves gravely weakened after decades of exhausting warfare. Their prolonged conflicts had drained treasuries, devastated populations, and left their armies battered and their political structures strained. It was in this fragile moment that a new force emerged from the deserts of the Arabian Peninsula, Islam, and with it, a series of conquests that would forever alter the course of history. The Arab conquests, driven by the newly unified Muslim Caliphate under the Rashidun leaders, capitalized on the vulnerabilities of both Byzantium and Persia. The Byzantine Empire, still recovering from the devastation wrought by the last Byzantine, Sasanian War under Emperor Heraclius, faced internal dissent, economic troubles, and military overextension. Likewise, the Sasanian Empire, after its defeat and the death of King Khosrow II, was plunged into civil war and political chaos. The initial Arab incursions began in the 630 CE. The Rashidun Caliphate launched campaigns into Sasanian territory with remarkable speed and coordination. The Battle of Al-Qadisiyah in 636 CE was a turning point, where Arab forces defeated a large Sasanian army, opening the door for the conquest of Mesopotamia. Cities such as Ctesiphon, once the proud capital of the Sasanians, fell to the invaders. Meanwhile, Byzantine defenses in Syria and Palestine struggled to hold the advancing Arab armies. The decisive Battle of Yarmouk in 636 CE saw the Byzantine forces suffer a crushing defeat, effectively ending Byzantine dominance in the Levant. The loss of Jerusalem in 638 CE was another heavy blow, deeply felt by the Christian Byzantine Empire. The Arab conquests unfolded rapidly, sweeping through key territories that had long been contested between Rome and Persia. Within a few decades, vast regions of the Near East, including Egypt, Syria, and Persia itself, came under Islamic rule. This marked the definitive end of the Roman, Persian wars that had dominated the region for centuries. The fall of these empires was not merely a military or political event but also a profound cultural and religious transformation. The Arab Caliphate spread Islam, Arabic language, and a new governance system that would shape the identity of the Middle East and beyond for centuries. Despite the decline of Byzantine and Sasanian power, the legacies of their conflicts endured. The centuries of Roman, Persian rivalry had forged administrative structures, urban centers, and cultural exchanges that the new Islamic rulers would inherit and build upon. The centuries-long conflict between the Roman, and later Byzantine, Empire and the Sasanian Persian Empire was far more than a prolonged military rivalry. It was a crucible that forged cultural, political, and social transformations that have echoed through history. Even after the fall of both empires, the legacies of their wars endured, influencing not only the territories they once controlled but also shaping the course of civilization in the Near East and beyond. At the heart of this legacy was the political and administrative sophistication both empires developed as a response to their constant struggle. Rome's emphasis on urban planning, fortified cities, and sophisticated road networks was intensified by the need to maintain control over vast frontier regions vulnerable to Persian incursions. The construction of massive fortresses and the establishment of buffer states, especially Armenia and the Caucasus kingdoms, were crucial strategies that underscored the interplay of military and political ingenuity. Similarly, the Sasanians inherited and expanded upon ancient Persian traditions of centralized bureaucracy and imperial governance. Their capital, Ctesiphon, became a hub of administration and culture, rivaling Rome's Constantinople. The Persians also developed an efficient tax system and fostered economic prosperity that funded their military campaigns and architectural projects, including grand palaces and fire temples. The wars facilitated a rich cultural exchange between the two empires. Despite hostility, trade routes, such as the Silk Road, remained active, allowing goods, ideas, and technologies to flow between East and West. Roman glassware, Persian textiles, and luxury goods found eager markets, while artistic styles and religious ideas influenced each other across borders. Religion played a complex role in the legacy of these conflicts. Christianity, which became the dominant religion of the Byzantine Empire, often stood in stark contrast to the Zoroastrian faith of the Sasanians. This religious divide was both a cause and effect of the rivalry. Christian communities in Persian territories frequently faced persecution, while the Byzantines saw themselves as defenders of the Christian faith. These tensions laid groundwork for future religious dynamics in the region, including the rise of Islam. The prolonged conflict also fostered advancements in military technology and tactics. Both empires developed specialized cavalry units, like the Byzantine cataphracts and Sasanian heavy horsemen, that influenced medieval warfare. Siege techniques, fortification design, and logistical innovations evolved through necessity, impacting subsequent military practices. Politically, the rivalry shaped the identities of both empires. The Byzantines viewed themselves as the heirs of Rome and protectors of Christian civilization, while the Sasanians embraced the revival of Persian imperial glory. This duality influenced their internal politics, diplomacy, and interactions with neighboring peoples. The impact of these conflicts extended beyond the Near East. Their outcomes influenced the power dynamics of Europe, Central Asia, and the Indian subcontinent. For example, the weakening of both empires after centuries of war created a power vacuum that facilitated the rapid expansion of Arab Muslim forces in the 7th century. Moreover, the cultural and architectural legacies, such as Byzantine mosaics and Persian miniature painting, continue to inspire art and scholarship today. The literature, historical chronicles, and administrative records from this era provide invaluable insights into the ancient world's complexities. Amid the centuries-long struggle between the Roman and Persian empires, much of the fighting took place not within the heartlands of either empire but along their contested borders. This vast frontier zone was inhabited by a mosaic of client kingdoms, tribal confederations, and semi-independent peoples whose allegiances, cultures, and ambitions profoundly influenced the course of the conflict. Understanding their role is crucial to comprehending how the Roman, Persian wars unfolded and why they lasted so long. these client kingdoms, such as Armenia, Iberia, modern-day Georgia, and the various Arab and Kurdish tribes, acted as buffers between the great imperial powers. They served as first lines of defense, and often became the battlegrounds for proxy wars. Both Rome and Persia sought to control these territories, not only for their strategic value but also as symbols of prestige and legitimacy. Armenia, in particular, was a focal point of this complex political dance. Positioned between the two empires, it experienced shifting allegiances and invasions throughout the centuries. Armenian kings frequently navigated a delicate balance, at times aligning with Rome for protection, at others with Persia to preserve their autonomy. This tug-of-war sometimes erupted into full-scale rebellions or wars, complicating the broader imperial conflict. The border peoples were not passive pawns. Many of these groups wielded considerable military power and knew how to exploit the rivalry for their advantage. For instance, Arab tribes in the Syrian desert and Mesopotamian fringes conducted raids, sometimes as mercenaries for one side, sometimes as independent raiders exploiting the chaos. Their mobility and knowledge of the terrain made them valuable allies or dangerous enemies. Similarly, the Caucasus tribes played critical roles. Their mountainous homelands provided natural fortresses, and they often acted as scouts, raiders, or defenders in the wars. Their loyalty was fluid, sometimes swayed by political promises, bribes, or the changing tides of war. The client kingdoms also contributed culturally and religiously to the broader rivalry. Armenia's adoption of Christianity in the early 4th century aligned it more closely with Rome's Christian identity, heightening tensions with Zoroastrian Persia. Religious loyalties thus intertwined with political and military alliances. Moreover, these border regions became melting pots where cultures mixed. Trade, intermarriage, and shared customs created hybrid identities that blended Roman, Persian, and indigenous influences. This cultural synthesis enriched the region but also complicated the rigid imperial dichotomy. The constant warfare placed immense burdens on these peoples. Cities were sacked, populations displaced, and economies disrupted. Yet, their resilience allowed them to survive and adapt, sometimes thriving in the interstices between empires. In many ways, the fates of the client kingdoms and border peoples reflected the broader dynamics of the Roman, Persian rivalry, a struggle for dominance that was not simply between two empires but involved diverse actors whose own ambitions shaped history. The conclusion of the long-standing conflicts between the Roman and Byzantine Empire and the Sasanian Persian Empire marked the end of an era, but their influence did not vanish with the fall of these ancient powers. Instead, the echoes of their rivalry shaped the political, cultural, and military landscapes of the medieval world and beyond, leaving an enduring legacy that would resonate through centuries of history. One of the most immediate and profound impacts was the geopolitical vacuum left in the Near East after the mutual exhaustion of both empires. The rapid expansion of the Islamic caliphates in the 7th century was facilitated by the weakened state of Byzantium and Persia, enabling the Arabs to conquer vast territories that had been battlegrounds for centuries. This shift not only redefined regional borders but also initiated a profound transformation in religious, cultural, and linguistic identity across the Middle East. The legacy of Roman and Persian administrative practices carried over into the governance systems of the Islamic empires. Both Byzantine bureaucratic efficiency and Sasanian centralized administration influenced the organization of the caliphates. For instance, the Islamic tax system and provincial governance structures reflected precedents set by their predecessors, showcasing a continuity of effective statecraft. Militarily, the innovations born from Roman, Persian warfare, including cavalry tactics, siegecraft, and fortification designs, found new expressions in the armies of medieval Islamic states and later European powers. The concept of heavily armored cavalry units, such as the Byzantine cataphracts and Persian sovereign, influenced medieval knightly warfare, while the sophisticated use of border fortresses and frontier defenses became models for later military architecture. Culturally, the exchange between these two empires facilitated the transmission of knowledge, art, and technology. The preservation and translation of classical Greek texts in Byzantine centers, as well as Persian scholarly works, contributed to the intellectual foundations of the Islamic Golden Age. This rich cultural inheritance bridged the ancient and medieval worlds, influencing philosophy, science, medicine, and literature. Religiously, the Roman-Persian rivalry underscored the tensions between Christianity and Zoroastrianism, setting the stage for the region's religious transformations. The subsequent rise of Islam introduced a new religious paradigm that both absorbed and redefined elements from its predecessors. The enduring religious diversity of the region, including Christian and Zoroastrian communities, reflects the complex heritage of these ancient conflicts. Furthermore, the memory of Roman and Persian empires shaped later imperial ambitions. Byzantine rulers continued to see themselves as heirs of Rome, aspiring to reclaim lost territories, while Persian identity persisted in various successor states, inspiring future dynasties such as the Safavids. The notion of a powerful, centralized empire in this region continued to captivate rulers and peoples alike. The Roman-Persian wars also influenced later European history. The Byzantine Empire served as a bridge transmitting classical knowledge and Eastern traditions to medieval Europe, especially during the Crusades. The complex history of these conflicts informed Western understanding of the East for centuries.